The dog refused to leave the cemetery. What they found beneath the soil moved everyone to tears. Sometimes, healing doesn't come from medicine but from fur, paws, and a heart that never leaves your side. This is one of those stories. A story of hope, faith, and love. Like, share, and subscribe if you believe in the bond between humans and dogs. The evening mist curled low across the old cemetery, wrapping the crooked stones in a silver veil that blurred the line between the living and the dead. The town's graveyard had always been a place of silence, where names carved into weathered slabs stood like quiet sentinels of the past. But that night, silence did not rule. From the farthest corner, where the earth dipped near the broken fence and weeds grew tall, a German shepherd sat planted firmly on one grave. His dark coat gleamed in the fading light, his chest heaving with relentless effort as his deep, desperate barks tore through the mist. He would not move. His paws pressed against the soil as if guarding it, his body shaking with a mix of urgency and grief, and his cries echoed through the empty air like a warning too important to ignore. People walking past slowed, their footsteps hesitant on the gravel path. They glanced at the dog with unease, their whispers drifting like the wind that stirred the dead leaves. "He's gone mad," someone muttered, shaking his head. "Dogs sense spirits," another replied in a hushed voice, clutching her shawl tighter as if to protect herself. Yet no one drew close. They stood at a distance, staring, their fear keeping them rooted on the safer paths while the shepherd continued his vigil alone. His eyes, wide and glistening, never left the mound beneath him. His cries rose and fell like waves, sometimes loud and furious, sometimes low and aching, but always insistent, as though he carried a secret too heavy for silence. The sky deepened to a bruise-colored dusk. Shadows lengthened across the cracked stones, stretching like dark fingers over the graves. The shepherd's cries became sharper, cutting through the gathering night like bells that would not stop ringing. Children tugged at their parents' coats, frightened by the sound, but still curious, their small voices asking, "Why won't he leave? What's he waiting for?" The adults had no answer. They pulled their little ones away, pretending it was nothing, though in their hearts they felt the pull of unease. For all their disbelief, they could not shake the sense that the dog knew something they did not. As the evening wind thickened into a chill, the cemetery felt less like a resting place and more like a stage where something was about to happen. Even those who scoffed at superstition found themselves glancing back over their shoulders, listening for the next bark, their spines prickling with dread. The dog's voice carried not just noise but urgency, as if every cry was a plea. "Look closer, do not walk away, something lies beneath this soil that cannot remain hidden." And so the night deepened, the mist thickened, and the shepherd did not move. His body was anchored by loyalty, his voice raw with desperation. The grave beneath him, once just another forgotten patch of earth, was now alive with questions that hung heavy in the air. Why this grave? Why this night? Why would a creature known for loyalty refuse to leave the cold ground, no matter how many times he was called? The answer would not be found in whispers. It would not be explained away by fear or superstition. The truth was buried, waiting in silence, and it would move not just one family but an entire town to tears. The town of Maplewood was the kind of place that looked unchanged for generations. Nestled between rolling hills and lined with maple trees that burned red every autumn, it carried a rhythm of life that was slow and predictable. People greeted each other on front porches, cafe windows fogged with steam from morning coffee, and old men gathered outside the hardware store to trade stories of the past. It was a place where everyone knew one another's name, where Sunday bells still called families to church, and where gossip flowed as freely as the river that cut through the fields. But beneath its charm lay secrets, tucked away in corners people rarely dared to look at too closely. One such corner was the cemetery that stretched along the edge of town. To the older generation, it was a sacred place, a space where memories rested with the dead. For the young, it was a place of dares, whispered about in the schoolyard but rarely visited after dark. The cemetery told the story of Maplewood more honestly than any history book. Its weathered stones bore the names of founders, farmers, soldiers, mothers, and children, generations of lives stacked in silence, each grave a sentence in the town's long story. On sunny days, it looked almost peaceful, its paths shaded by tall oaks and its fences lined with ivy. But as evening shadows stretched long, it transformed into something heavier, as if the earth itself carried whispers too soft for human ears. Among the rows of graves, one section stood apart. It was the farthest corner, where the fence sagged and weeds grew untamed, as though time itself had decided to forget it. Few visitors ever went there. Families preferred to place flowers on the newer graves closer to the chapel, where polished stones shone white and clean. The forgotten corners seemed neglected, its markers tilted, some broken, their names fading with age. It was there, in this lonely section, that the German shepherd had begun to linger. At first, the townsfolk ignored it. Dogs wandered all the time, and it was easy to dismiss his presence as coincidence. But as days passed, whispers grew. The shepherd did not just pass through, he stayed. Morning to night, he sat near one particular grave, his body tense, his eyes fixed. He refused to be lured away by food or by calls from children who had tried to coax him with kindness. His loyalty was unnerving. It was as if he had claimed that patch of earth as his own, guarding it against something unseen. The whispers in Maplewood began to change. Old women in shawls shook their heads and murmured, "Dogs see what we cannot." Teenagers dared one another to step into the corner at dusk, but most turned back, uneasy with the way the shepherd's gaze seemed to pierce through them. Even men who laughed at superstition admitted something about the scene felt wrong. "It's not natural," one farmer said as he passed by. "He's waiting for something." And then there were the small signs, strange, quiet things that unsettled even the most rational. Fresh flowers left on the grave by some unknown hand were found scattered across the ground. Their stems snapped as if they had been clawed away. On windless nights, petals drifted far from where they had been placed. More than once, villagers claimed to hear soft scratching sounds when they passed that part of the cemetery, though no animal could be seen. Even the ground itself seemed unsettled. One morning, dew revealed faint indentations across the soil, too shallow to be dug by man, too orderly to be left by chance. People tried to explain it away. Foxes, raccoons, the weather. But explanations could not soothe the unease that spread. And always, without fail, the shepherd remained. Rain soaked his fur, snow gathered on his back, the summer heat beat down on his shoulders, yet he did not move. He barked sometimes, low and fierce, as if warning off something unseen. Other times he whined, a sound so mournful it cut through the heart of anyone who heard it. The cemetery, once a place people avoided simply out of discomfort, became a place they avoided out of fear. Mothers pulled their children closer when passing by, fathers walked faster, eyes lowered. Even in broad daylight, the corner seemed darker, as though the shadows lingered longer over that one grave. And always the whispers followed, "Why does he stay there? What could keep a dog from leaving? What lies beneath the soil that holds him so tightly?" No one had answers. But the questions grew heavier with every passing day, and soon the town of Maplewood would learn that some secrets cannot remain buried forever. They began to call him Shadow. The name fit, for he moved silently through the town, his dark coat blending into alleys and fields until he slipped back to his chosen place in the cemetery. No one claimed him, yet he seemed to belong to everyone. He was not a stray in the ordinary sense. He was too strong, too intelligent, too steady in his movements. His body was lean but not frail, his eyes bright and unyielding. There was purpose in the way he carried himself, the kind of purpose only a creature with deep loyalty could know. Shadow's vigil was unshakable. Morning after morning, he returned to the same grave, lowering himself onto the damp ground as if it were his rightful home. The seasons turned, but his devotion never wavered. In the chill of dawn, frost dusting the grass, he was there. In the heavy heat of midday, his chest rising slowly as he endured, he was there. Even when storms swept in from the hills, driving people indoors, Shadow remained. His body trembled under sheets of rain, his fur soaked through, but his paws stayed pressed firmly against the earth. Kind-hearted villagers tried to coax him away. An old baker left out scraps of meat, whistling softly as he approached, but Shadow only glanced up before lowering his head again, as if food could never tempt him from his post. Children, too young to understand, offered toys and sticks, waving them with hopeful shouts, but Shadow's gaze never shifted from the mound of soil before him. Once, a farmer brought a thick blanket on a freezing night, spreading it on the grass in front of the dog. Shadow ignored it completely, curling himself against the grave instead, his body the only shield he seemed to believe mattered. What unsettled the townsfolk most was the way Shadow seemed not merely to wait, but to mourn. His eyes, so sharp and alive when they followed the movements of strangers, softened when they fell back to the grave. There was sorrow in them, heavy and human-like, as though he were holding a grief he could not explain. At times, he dug at the soil with steady, deliberate strokes of his paws, not enough to uncover, but enough to disturb the ground. When confronted, he would pause, glance toward the onlooker, then return to his task with quiet determination. It was not the frantic digging of an ordinary dog. It was the patient persistence of a creature convinced that something beneath the earth needed him still. The whispers of Maplewood grew darker. Some said Shadow was waiting for a master buried there, too loyal to move on. Others claimed he sensed a restless spirit, something trapped and crying out in silence. The older folk nodded knowingly, muttering that animals could see what human eyes could not. Dogs don't sit on graves without reason, they warned. Skeptics scoffed, but even they avoided the corner after dusk, unnerved by the dog's unwavering presence. Nights were the hardest for those who lived near the cemetery. Shadow's barks carried through the mist, low and thunderous, rattling the shutters of nearby houses. Sometimes, his voice shifted into a mournful howl that raised the hair on the back of one's neck. It was not the sound of aggression but of longing, a call that seemed to reach for something beyond the veil of the earth. Families lay awake, listening, their unease growing heavier with each night. "He's warning us," one man whispered to his wife as the howls echoed again. "He's telling us there's something down there." Yet no matter how uneasy they felt, no one tried to drive Shadow away. It was not just fear that kept them from it, but respect. His devotion was too fierce, his presence too commanding. To force him from his place seemed not only impossible but wrong, as if breaking some sacred rule that only he understood. And so, Shadow's vigil continued. He became part of the cemetery itself, as constant as the stones and soil. Visitors who passed through now expected to see him there, sitting solemnly, paws pressed to the ground, his gaze locked on the grave as though it held the key to his very soul. And though no one dared disturb him, they could not silence the growing question that clung to their minds. What could hold a creature so loyal, so unyielding in one place for so long? The answer, they knew, would not be simple. And Shadow, with every bark and every mournful glance, seemed to be telling them that sooner or later, the truth would rise. One quiet afternoon, when the town carried on with its usual rhythm of creaking porch swings and distant church bells, a young mother passed the cemetery with her daughter. The child was no more than 3 years old, her blue dress swaying as she skipped along the path, her laughter bubbling like a stream. Her tiny hands clutched a worn rag doll, its fabric faded from love and play. The mother, distracted by her errands, barely noticed when her daughter stopped near the iron gate and pressed her small face to the bars. It was then that she saw him, Shadow, lying low against the grave, his head resting on his paws, his golden eyes fixed and unblinking. The little girl's laughter faded into silence. She tilted her head, studying him with the unfiltered curiosity only children possess. After a moment, her soft voice broke the hush. "Mama," she asked, tugging at her mother's sleeve, "why is the dog sad? Who is he waiting for?" The question startled the woman. She pulled her daughter away quickly, her eyes flicking to the corner of the cemetery where the shepherd sat unmoving. She muttered something about staying close, but the unease in her voice betrayed her. The child resisted, her gaze still fixed on the dog, unwilling to look away. To her innocent heart, Shadow was not frightening. He was lonely. He was calling out in a way she could not understand but could feel all the same. The little girl wriggled free of her mother's grasp and tiptoed closer to the gate. Her shoes scraped against the stones as she leaned forward, her doll dangling in one hand. "Why won't you go home?" she called softly, her voice carrying across the stillness. Shadow lifted his head at the sound. For a brief moment, his ears perked and his eyes shifted from the grave to the child. His body trembled as though torn between two worlds, one anchored to the soil beneath him and the other stirred by the innocence of the tiny figure at the gate. Encouraged, the child held out her doll through the bars, her gesture simple and pure. "Here," she said, "you can have her. She will make you happy." Her hand shook slightly as she offered her most precious toy, the one she never slept without, the one she guarded from other children with the fierce pride only toddlers know. Yet she extended it without hesitation, as though she sensed the dog's need was greater than her own. But Shadow did not move. He sniffed the air, his gaze flickering between the doll and the soil beneath him. Then, slowly, he lowered his head again onto his paws, letting out a low whine that sounded almost like a sigh. The child's smile faltered. She pulled the doll back to her chest, hugging it tightly, her eyes wide and glassy. "Mama," she whispered, "he's crying. The dog is crying." Her mother hurried forward, scooping her into her arms, her heart pounding with unease. "That's enough," she said firmly, though her voice trembled. "Don't talk to him. Dogs like that, they don't belong to us." But the little girl clung to her mother's shoulder, her face turned back toward the corner. "But Mama," she insisted softly, "he's waiting for someone. Why won't anyone help him?" Her words, though spoken with the innocence of a child, spread unease like ripples across water. Others who had paused to watch exchanged glances, their expressions tightening. Adults carried explanations in their heads. Dogs don't feel sorrow like people. Dogs don't wait by graves without reason. But hearing the questions from the lips of a child stripped away their defenses. It made their excuses feel hollow, even cruel. Later that evening, when the story was told in whispers across porches and kitchens, the townsfolk admitted how the little girl's questions had unsettled them more than the dog's vigil itself. For it was one thing to see Shadow's loyalty, but it was another to hear it named by a child who still lived in a world unspoiled by disbelief. Her innocence had pierced through the doubts they clung to, leaving only a gnawing fear that maybe, just maybe, there truly was something waiting beneath the soil. From that day on, whenever the little girl passed the cemetery, she slowed at the gate. Sometimes she waved, sometimes she whispered, "I'll come back tomorrow." And Shadow, though he never left his grave, seemed to acknowledge her presence with the faintest flick of his ears, as though her small voice reached him in ways the adults never could. The town grew quieter after her words. Conversations that once carried laughter now carried weight. Neighbors lowered their voices when passing the cemetery, their eyes lingering longer on the corner where Shadow kept watch. And though no one admitted it aloud, more than one person confessed privately that they now heard something new when the dog barked at night. It was not just noise. It was not madness. It was a cry for help, clear and aching, just as the child had said. The sky had been restless all evening, heavy with thick clouds that rolled in from the hills. By nightfall, the first drops of rain began to patter on rooftops, and the wind carried with it the sharp scent of an oncoming storm. The old cemetery, always a place of silence, looked darker than ever. Trees bent in the wind, their branches creaking like old bones. Shadows stretched long across the ground, and the broken iron gate rattled against its hinges with every gust. In that forgotten corner, by the weathered grave, Shadow remained. His fur was damp, his body trembling, but he did not move away. Instead, he barked into the howling wind, his voice louder, sharper, desperate, as though fighting against the storm itself. His paws dug frantically at the soil, throwing clumps of dirt behind him. Each strike of his claws seemed driven by something deeper than instinct. From their porches, the townsfolk watched uneasily. Lanterns flickered in windows, their light trembling with every clap of thunder. A few neighbors stepped outside, holding jackets against the rain, their eyes drawn again and again to the cemetery. "That dog will go mad one of these nights," muttered one man, shaking his head. Yet even he did not look away. Something about the shepherd's cries was impossible to ignore. The storm grew fierce. Lightning split the sky in jagged white veins, illuminating the headstones for a brief instant before plunging everything back into blackness. With each flash, Shadow's form appeared like a statue, ears pinned back, fur slick with rain, body crouched low as he barked at the earth. His eyes burned with a strange fire, glowing when the light struck them, like a soul possessed by purpose. The villagers whispered among themselves, their voices thin against the roar of the storm. "He's digging harder tonight. He won't give up. Maybe he knows something we don't." Fear twisted with fascination in their tone. Adults told themselves there was nothing beneath the soil but roots and worms, yet their hearts pounded with unease. Then, amid the storm's chaos, something changed. A sound rose above the thunder, not loud, not clear, but enough to still the air. It came from the earth itself, faint and muffled, as though trapped beneath layers of soil. At first, it sounded like the moan of the wind threading through broken stones. But as the villagers leaned closer, straining to hear, it became undeniable. It was a cry, soft, weak, trembling, a sound that did not belong to thunder, nor storm, nor shadow. It was the cry of life, muted, desperate, buried. The villagers froze. Some gasped. Others crossed themselves, their faces pale. "Did you hear that?" one whispered. "Tell me I'm not mad." Another clutched his wife's arm, eyes wide with disbelief. That was a voice. Shadow barked louder, his whole body quaking with urgency. He pawed the ground as though his very life depended on it. His cries cut through the storm, not random barks but the sharp, rhythmic sound of a dog calling for help. He glanced back toward the village houses, his eyes pleading, before returning to the grave. For a long moment, no one moved. The storm pressed harder, sheets of rain slashing against the earth, thunder cracking overhead like war drums. The villagers stood frozen in the glow of their lamps, their hearts telling them what their minds refused to believe. Beneath that soil, beneath the grave Shadow refused to leave, something was alive. A woman's voice broke the silence. She was old, her back bent, her hands gripping the railing of her porch. "I told you," she cried above the storm. "That dog isn't mad. He's waiting. He's showing us something." Her words carried across the street like a spark in the dark, igniting the fear and wonder in every listener. Shadow let out a long, low howl that cut through the night. It was not the cry of an animal, but something closer to grief, closer to love, a sound that pierced bone and heart alike. And as the howl faded into the storm, another faint noise rose from below. This time clear, this time unmistakable. A whimper. The villagers gasped. Someone dropped their lantern, and it sputtered in the rain. Mothers pulled their children close, shielding their ears though they themselves strained to listen. The sound came again, a tiny, muffled plea for life. The storm no longer felt like the greatest danger. What lay beneath the soil, hidden for so long, now demanded to be uncovered. And Shadow, soaked to the bone, barking himself hoarse, refused to stop until someone listened. In that moment, the town could no longer dismiss him. The storm might rage, the night might frighten, but there was no denying the truth anymore. Someone, was waiting under that grave, and the shepherd would not give up until the world came to see. The storm had passed, but the whispers it left behind stayed with the townsfolk like a ghost refusing to leave. People could not forget the sound they thought they heard during the night, that faint cry buried under thunder and rain. Some dismissed it as imagination, others as fear, but none could ignore the German shepherd sitting stubbornly on the grave. Shadow had not moved an inch. His paws were raw from digging, his fur matted with mud, yet his eyes remained fixed on the mound of earth, unblinking, determined. By dawn, more villagers gathered near the cemetery fence, whispering nervously as the dog barked and whined. It was the young mother who finally broke the circle of doubt. She had been the one whose little daughter offered Shadow her toy, the one who had asked those innocent questions that no adult could answer. With fear in her eyes, she pulled her shawl tighter and said, "This isn't right. A dog doesn't cry like this for nothing. I'm calling the sheriff." Her voice cut through the murmurs, and though her husband hesitated, shifting uneasily beside her, he could not stop her from dialing. The call was made, and within the hour, flashing red and blue lights painted the gray headstones with colors they had never seen before. The sheriff arrived with 2 deputies, men used to dealing with broken fences, rowdy neighbors, and drunks at the local bar, not mysteries buried in graves. They stepped out of their cars, their flashlights casting sharp beams across the misty cemetery. "What's all this fuss?" the sheriff asked, his tone calm but carrying the weight of authority. The crowd parted to let him through, pointing toward the corner where Shadow stood his ground. The shepherd's ears twitched at the sound of boots crunching gravel. He rose to his feet, his muscles tense, and when the sheriff approached, Shadow let out a deep growl. It was not aggression, it was warning. The sheriff crouched, shining his light across the soil. Loose earth, paw prints, scratches, clear evidence that the dog had been working the ground for days. Slowly, the sheriff stood again, his eyes narrowing. "This grave's been disturbed," he muttered. The villagers pressed closer, their whispers urgent. An old woman leaned on her cane, her voice trembling but strong. "Last night we all heard it. A cry. Don't tell us it was just the storm. We know what we heard." Others nodded, their fear becoming courage in numbers. The sheriff frowned, adjusting his hat. He turned to his deputies. "Check it." One deputy knelt, pressing his ear against the soil, and for a long moment there was nothing but silence. Then his head jerked up, eyes wide. "Sheriff, I heard something. Faint, but it's there." A gasp rippled through the crowd, and Shadow barked furiously, pawing at the earth as though confirming the truth. The sheriff's voice grew sharp, his calm breaking. "Get the paramedics on the line. Call in backup. Bring shovels. Now." Radios crackled to life, and within minutes, the quiet graveyard became a place of rushing footsteps, shouted orders, and tense anticipation. More villagers streamed in, drawn by curiosity and fear, until the cemetery looked like the heart of the entire town. Mothers clutched their children, fathers whispered prayers, and the old kept shaking their heads, muttering about omens and signs. Shadow refused to move. Even as the sheriff stepped closer with his men, the shepherd stood firm, growling low, guarding the grave as if it belonged not to the dead but to the living struggling beneath. His eyes glistened with desperation, his body trembling with urgency. He was not just a dog anymore. He was a messenger, forcing humans to see what they wanted to ignore. The sheriff removed his hat and held it to his chest. His voice lowered as though speaking to the earth itself. Lord, help us, because if there's life under here, every second counts. His words carried through the cemetery, falling into the silence of the crowd like stones into water. Some wept openly, others stood frozen, and still, the shepherd barked, his voice raw and unrelenting. That grave, once forgotten in the farthest corner of the cemetery, was no longer a place of silence. It had become the center of hope and dread, the place where an entire town waited for the truth to rise. The cemetery that had once been so silent was now filled with the sound of hurried shovels striking the soil. Police officers, joined by local rescuers and a few townsfolk who couldn't stand idly by, formed a half-circle around the grave. Flashlights cut through the mist, beams trembling as the men's hands shook with urgency. The air was heavy, not just with the scent of damp earth but with dread. People held their breath, afraid that each strike of the shovel might uncover something too terrible to face, yet equally afraid of what would happen if they stopped. Shadow stood only a few feet away, his body pressed low against the ground, his barking echoing through the gravestones like a drumbeat of desperation. His paws clawed at the soil whenever the rescuers paused, urging them onward. His deep, guttural cries carried more weight than words ever could, as though he knew exactly what was buried below and could not allow them to waste a second. The sheriff stood at the edge, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on the ground being turned over. He had seen death before, accidents on the highway, drownings in the river, soldiers brought home in flag-covered coffins. But this felt different. This felt alive. Every gust of wind that rattled the branches above seemed to whisper the same thing. Hurry. The soil was stubborn, damp from the storm, heavy and clinging to the shovels. The men grunted, sweat mixing with mud even in the cool night air. The smell grew stronger as they dug deeper, a strange coldness rising from below, chilling the rescuers' hands and faces. It was not the clean, sharp cold of winter air, but something heavier, wetter, as though the earth itself was exhaling. A deputy paused, shining his flashlight into the hole. His face went pale. "Sheriff, look." The beam of light revealed faint grooves in the packed earth, long and jagged, like lines carved in desperation. The soil hadn't settled naturally. Someone or something had clawed upward, trying to escape. Gasps rippled through the crowd. An old man crossed himself, whispering a prayer. A young woman buried her face in her husband's chest. The whispers grew louder, fearful, urgent. "Scratches, there are scratches. Someone was alive down there. Dear Lord, what have we done?" The rescuers dug faster now, their fear replaced by frantic energy. Dirt flew over their shoulders in dark sprays. The cold grew sharper, crawling over their skin until goosebumps rose along their arms. And then, with one final strike, the shovel struck something solid. A hollow sound rang out, the unmistakable echo of wood. The rescuers froze. The sheriff stepped forward, his flashlight trembling as he directed the beam downward. A coffin lid, weathered, damp, and splintered at the edges, but intact. The rescuers exchanged grim looks. Some wanted to stop, fearing what they would see if they opened it. But Shadow would not allow hesitation. He lunged forward, his paws digging furiously at the wooden surface. his claws scraping against it until sparks of sound filled the night. He barked wildly, his entire body shaking with urgency. The sheriff's voice cracked like a whip. "Get it open. Now." With crowbars and bare hands, the men attacked the coffin lid. Wood splintered, nails groaned, and the scratches carved deep into its surface became clearer. They weren't old. They weren't weathered by time. They were fresh. Each mark was the signature of struggle, proof that someone inside had fought to live. One rescuer dropped his tool, his voice trembling as he whispered, "They were alive. Dear God, they were alive." The lid cracked. Damp air rushed upward, hitting them like the breath of the grave itself. But in that moment, another sound rose too, a faint, muffled thump. Then another. Movement. The crowd erupted with cries. Some screamed, others shouted prayers, many sobbed openly. The rescuers worked with renewed ferocity, their arms burning, their muscles aching, until at last the lid gave way. The wood split open, and every light turned inward, piercing the darkness below. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then a weak movement stirred in the shadows. Small fingers twitched, pale against the rough interior. A whimper followed, soft but real, the sound of life clinging desperately to hope. Shadow went wild, his barking turning to high-pitched cries, his body lunging forward as if he could reach inside and pull the soul back himself. The villagers gasped in disbelief. Tears ran down faces hardened by years of life's burdens. People clutched one another, sobbing openly as the truth settled in. This wasn't a story of ghosts or omens. This was flesh and blood, life where there should have been only death. Inside the coffin, nestled in the damp and dark, lay a small figure. A child. Covered in dirt, hair tangled, skin pale, but unmistakably alive. Curled beside them, shivering but breathing, was a small puppy, its body pressed close as if it had shared its warmth to keep the child alive. The rescuers froze, overcome by the impossible sight. Some couldn't move for their tears, others whispered broken prayers. But the sheriff's voice roared through the chaos, snapping them back into action. "Get them out. Now." Hands reached inside with trembling care, gently lifting the frail bodies. The puppy whimpered weakly, the child's chest rose in shallow breaths. The moment they emerged from the coffin, the cemetery erupted into sound, gasps, cries, cheers, prayers. Hardened police officers wiped their eyes. Mothers clutched their children tighter. The weight of the miracle pressed on every soul present. Shadow whined, circling, pressing his nose against the child's arm, licking the dirt from their skin. He would not leave them. He had known. He had never doubted. In that moment, the graveyard was no longer a place of death. It was a place of rebirth, of hope clawed back from despair. And all of it, every second of life rescued, belonged to the dog who refused to give up. The moment the coffin lid cracked open, the cemetery, once filled only with whispers and wind, erupted into a storm of sound. Some villagers gasped so loud it seemed to echo across the gravestones. Others cried out in disbelief, their trembling hands clutching each other. It was as if time itself had paused, holding the entire town in suspense, before releasing them into chaos. Rescuers leaned deeper into the grave, their flashlights shaking as the beams illuminated what no one thought they would ever see. The faint rise and fall of a small chest, dirt-streaked but alive. A child. Fragile, frail, their hair matted, their lips pale, but unmistakably breathing. And in that terrible darkness, the child had not been alone, because a tiny puppy lay curled against their body, shivering, its weak whimpers barely audible above the cries of the crowd. "Dear Lord," one of the officers whispered, his tough exterior cracking. His voice broke into silence, as if even words couldn't capture the weight of the moment. The sheriff, who had seen war, wrecks, and every manner of tragedy, pressed his hand against his mouth, eyes glassy with tears he had never allowed himself to show. The rescuers worked fast now. Ropes were lowered, hands reached down, and commands were barked between sobs. "Careful, lift slowly. Don't jolt the child." The damp soil slid around their boots as they braced themselves. With every pull upward, the cries of the villagers grew louder, prayers overlapping in a chorus of desperation. Women clutched candles against the night wind, the small flames trembling just like their hearts. Some villagers fell to their knees, murmuring, "Please God, let them live, please." The wooden lid was pushed aside completely now, broken into jagged pieces, the scratch marks along its interior glowing eerily under the flashlight beams. Every line was a story of struggle, proof that the child had fought for every breath until Shadow's relentless barking had brought help. The crowd sobbed openly at the sight, realizing just how close life had come to slipping away forever. Finally, two strong rescuers lifted the child carefully into their arms. The child's head lolled weakly against one man's chest, and for a dreadful moment, silence gripped the cemetery. Then came the faintest whimper, a weak gasp for air. The sound sent the crowd into a wave of cries and cheers. Hardened men wiped their faces with the back of their hands. Mothers pressed their children close, whispering thanks into their hair. Even the sheriff bowed his head, overcome. The puppy was lifted out next, its small body trembling but alive. It whimpered until it was placed gently beside the child on a blanket, and then, despite its weakness, it pressed its tiny nose against the child's arm as if to say, "We made it out together." Shadow, the loyal shepherd, surged forward. He pressed his nose against the child's chest, licking the dirt from their cheek. His tail wagged slowly, uncertainly, as though afraid to hope. Then, when the child's hand twitched faintly against his fur, Shadow let out a sound no one had heard from him before, something between a howl and a sob. It echoed into the night, raw and heartbreaking, the cry of a dog who had found his purpose fulfilled. The rescuers laid the child on a stretcher. Oxygen masks were fitted, warm blankets tucked around the fragile body. The puppy was placed carefully against the child's side, their bond too powerful to break. Paramedics moved quickly, their voices calm but urgent, rattling off instructions as they checked vitals, each number sounding like a lifeline. Weak pulse, shallow breathing, but alive. The cemetery crowd stood frozen, candles flickering in the wind. Some people covered their mouths, unable to stop their sobs. Others reached out as if they could pass their strength through the air to the small figure on the stretcher. A few villagers fainted outright, overwhelmed by the miracle unfolding before their eyes. The sheriff's voice finally cut through the noise, steady but shaking. "This town will never forget this night." His words carried weight, not just as an officer but as a man who had seen more than most. "We came here expecting silence. We leave with life." As the stretcher was carried through the cemetery gates, Shadow followed at its side, every step measured, protective. He would not be pulled back, no matter how many hands tried to stop him. It was clear to everyone. He belonged to this child now, bound by something deeper than words. Behind them, the crowd began to disperse slowly, some lighting lanterns, others placing flowers on graves as though reminded of how fragile life was, how sacred each breath could be. The old cemetery, once feared and forgotten, now stood as the setting of a miracle. A place where loyalty and innocence had dug through darkness to pull life back from death. Even hardened officers, men known for keeping their emotions locked away, walked out with wet faces. One deputy admitted softly to his partner, "I've never seen anything like this, not in all my years." That dog saved them. That dog changed everything. The sound of sirens grew louder as ambulances pulled up to the cemetery gates, red and blue lights painting the tombstones in eerie colors. The paramedics transferred the child onto a gurney, tucking the puppy gently beside them. Shadow leaped up, trying to climb onto the ambulance step, and though the medics hesitated, the sheriff gave a firm nod. "Let him go. He's earned it." As the doors closed, the final image for the town to see was unforgettable. The fragile child, wrapped in blankets, breathing through an oxygen mask, the tiny puppy curled against their side, and Shadow, sitting tall at their feet, eyes glowing with loyalty under the harsh lights. The villagers remained at the cemetery long after the vehicles had gone, some still crying, others praying. They knew they had witnessed something holy, something that could not be explained away by science or reason. A graveyard had given back life. And at the heart of it all was a dog who refused to leave until the truth was uncovered. The ambulance tore down the quiet country road, its sirens wailing through the night. Inside, the child lay motionless beneath layers of blankets, the steady hiss of oxygen filling the small space. Nurses leaned over her tiny body, adjusting monitors and checking vitals, their hands moving quickly but carefully. Every second mattered. Beside her stretcher sat Shadow. The German shepherd had refused to be separated. No command, no gentle tug could make him leave. He had leapt onto the ambulance step as though it was his sacred duty, and now he pressed close, his nose nudging the child's hand every few moments. His dark eyes never wavered, as if willing her to stay alive through sheer loyalty. The puppy, weak but breathing, lay curled at the child's feet under a small towel. Occasionally it whimpered softly, and Shadow would lower his head, sniffing gently as if reassuring the little one, "We're safe now." Even the paramedics, hardened by countless emergencies, exchanged glances. One whispered, "That dog's not just watching, he's guarding." At the hospital, bright lights flooded the emergency entrance. Doctors and nurses rushed forward, waiting to take over. The gurney rolled quickly down the corridor, wheels rattling on the tile floor. Yet Shadow stayed close, padding alongside, his nails clicking softly with every determined step. When a nurse tried to block his way, the sheriff simply raised a hand. "Let him through. He's part of this." Inside the treatment room, doctors surrounded the child, working with calm urgency. Four lines were connected, warm fluids started, monitors lit up with flickering green lines. A nurse cleaned the child's face, wiping away dirt and dried tears, while another gently placed a heated blanket over her small body. For a moment, the room was filled only with the beeping of machines and the quiet instructions passed between the team. Through it all, Shadow sat just a few feet away, eyes fixed on the bed. His ears perked at every sound, his body tense with worry. When the child's hand twitched faintly, Shadow rose, stepping closer, and gently licked her fingers. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried the weight of everything he had done, every hour he had refused to leave that grave, every bark that had pulled people to this moment. Doctors noticed the faintest improvement, a stronger pulse, deeper breaths. "She's responding," one said, and though the words were clinical, they carried relief like a prayer answered. Outside the room, villagers and officers waited, pacing the halls, murmuring prayers. When news spread that the child was alive, the hallway erupted with tears, hugs, and cries of joy. Hardened men wiped their eyes. Women clasped their hands over their mouths in gratitude. The sheriff, his voice thick with emotion, told the crowd, "If not for that dog, we would never have looked. Tonight he saved a life." The days that followed became a story the town would never forget. The little girl slowly regained her strength, her cheeks gaining color, her eyes fluttering open for the first time. When she stirred, the first sight she saw was Shadow's dark eyes watching her from the bedside. She raised a trembling hand toward him, and without hesitation, he pressed his head into her palm. A soft gasp filled the room as nurses and parents witnessed the bond forming in that very instant. From then on, Shadow refused to leave her side. He lay on the hospital floor, his body curled near her bed, rising only when she stirred or whimpered. At night, when the machines beeped softly in the darkness, he kept watch with eyes half closed but ears alert, as if no danger would dare cross the threshold while he was there. Nurses learned to step gently, careful not to disturb him, for they understood he was no ordinary visitor. He was her guardian. The puppy, too, though fragile, was nursed back to health. It often curled beside the child's legs, comforted by the warmth of her small body and Shadow's constant presence. Together, they became a picture that touched every heart who passed through that ward: the fragile child, the weak puppy, and the loyal shepherd watching over them like a soldier. Soon, the story spread beyond the town. Local newspapers ran headlines: "Dog refuses to leave cemetery, saves child's life." Reporters visited, photographing Shadow at the hospital doors, his steady posture a symbol of hope. Letters poured in from across the state, people who had lost faith in kindness now finding it again through the loyalty of one dog. When the child was finally well enough to leave, the hospital staff lined the corridors. Some clapped softly, others simply wept. Shadow walked proudly beside the wheelchair, his head high, his tail wagging gently. The girl, still weak but smiling faintly, clutched his fur as if it was the only anchor she trusted. The puppy rested on her lap, nuzzled into her arms. Outside, the entire town had gathered. Families, neighbors, strangers, everyone stood waiting, candles and flowers in hand. As the doors opened and the child appeared, a cheer rose into the sky, mingling with tears and prayers. People held their children closer, their hearts heavy with gratitude. The mayor stepped forward, his voice breaking as he spoke. "This dog, Shadow, has reminded us what loyalty truly means. Without him, we would have buried a secret forever. With him, we found a miracle." He placed a medal gently around Shadow's neck, not as a token of formality, but as a symbol of what the town now owed him. Yet Shadow did not care for medals or applause. As the crowd cheered and wept, he remained close to the little girl, his nose pressed against her hand. For him, the only victory was her heartbeat, her breath, her life. That night, when the town finally settled into a hush, candles still glowing outside the hospital, the sheriff spoke to a reporter quietly. "I've served 30 years, seen the worst of humanity. But tonight I saw the best of creation. Not in us, but in that dog. He was the only one who wouldn't give up. And because of that, we have a child alive today." Shadow had become more than a hero. He was the town's reminder that loyalty, love, and instinct could shine brighter than fear or doubt. His vigil at the grave had not been madness. It had been purpose. And now that purpose was fulfilled, written into the hearts of everyone who had witnessed the miracle. In the days that followed, the little American town seemed changed. For years, its cemetery had been a place of silence and shadows, a place people visited only to leave flowers before hurrying away. It had been seen as gloomy, a reminder of endings. But now, people walked through its gates with softer steps, carrying not only grief but also gratitude. What once felt like a cold resting ground had become a symbol of survival, a place where a miracle had taken root. The story of the child's rescue spread quickly, not just through the streets and porches of the town but across the state. Newspapers carried the headline, "German Shepherd's Loyalty Saves Child in Cemetery Miracle." Photos of Shadow sitting by the hospital bed were printed beside the words, his dark eyes glowing with quiet strength. People who had never met the dog or the girl still found themselves wiping tears from their eyes as they read. "This is what we needed to believe again," one letter to the editor said. And it was true. At a time when hope often felt scarce, One dog had reminded them of what mattered most. For the little girl, healing came slowly but surely. She grew stronger each day, her small frame filling out, her cheeks brightening with color. Yet the one constant in her recovery was Shadow. Every morning he was there, his nose pressed gently against her hand. Every night he lay curled at the foot of her bed, a silent guardian. Nurses noticed that she seemed calmer when Shadow was near, her breathing steadier, her fears melting away when his head rested against her arm. It was as though her fragile heart had recognized the bond from the very beginning, that this dog had fought for her when no one else knew she was there. The bond between them deepened quickly. When she smiled, it was often at him. When she whispered her first words after recovery, they were soft but clear, "Good boy." And Shadow, hearing those words, wagged his tail with pride, as if he understood the weight they carried. He had not just saved her life. He had become her family, her comfort, her protector. Villagers often visited the hospital just to see them together. Parents would quietly guide their children to peek into the room, whispering, "Look, that's the little girl Shadow saved." The children would press their faces to the glass, watching as the girl clutched her puppy and Shadow lay nearby, eyes half closed but always alert. It was a sight that stirred even the hardest of hearts. The cemetery itself became a place of pilgrimage in a way no one could have expected. People began leaving fresh flowers not only on the graves of their loved ones but also at the very spot where Shadow had kept his vigil. Candles were placed there at night, glowing softly against the old stones. Some visitors prayed, others simply stood in silence, but all left with a sense that something extraordinary had taken place on that ground. Where once only grief lingered, hope now bloomed. The sheriff, often known for his stern and steady ways, admitted one evening at a town gathering, "I've worked 30 years, and I thought I had seen it all. But this was different. No training, no badge, no law could have done what that dog did. Loyalty uncovered what reason could not." His words carried through the room, and for a long moment, no one spoke. They simply nodded, many wiping tears, because they knew he was right. As weeks passed, the child was finally released from the hospital. The day she came home, Shadow trotted proudly at her side, tail swaying like a banner of victory. The townspeople lined the streets, clapping softly, some even crying as the little girl waved shyly from her mother's arms. Shadow walked close, ever watchful, while the puppy nestled in the girl's lap. Together, they were a living symbol of resilience. At night, when the town grew quiet and lanterns flickered on porches, people reflected on what they had seen. Many said they felt a deeper respect for the loyalty of animals, realizing that sometimes instincts spoke louder than logic. Others admitted they had been humbled, that while they had ignored the dog's barking at first, dismissing it as madness, he had been carrying the truth all along. For the little girl and her family, Shadow became more than a hero. He became part of their lives. The cemetery, once feared, now felt almost like sacred ground to them. They visited often, leaving flowers and standing quietly by the grave where Shadow had first refused to leave. The mother would squeeze her daughter's hand and whisper, "This is where you were given back to me." And Shadow would stand tall beside them, his eyes reflecting both the pain of the past and the peace of the present. The reflection was not only about one dog or one child, it was about what the entire town had learned. They saw clearly that miracles are not always thunderous or grand. Sometimes they are hidden in forgotten corners, waiting to be uncovered by loyalty and love. Sometimes it takes innocence, like a child's question, or devotion, like a dog's refusal to leave, to reveal truths reason alone could never find. And so, when people spoke of the event in the months that followed, they never described it as just a rescue. They called it the night the cemetery gave back life. They called Shadow not only a hero but a teacher, one who reminded them all that love is most powerful when it refuses to give up. The little girl grew stronger each day, her laughter filling her home once again. And Shadow, always by her side, walked with a proud but gentle step, as though knowing his place in her life was forever secured. In his eyes shone a quiet truth, that sometimes the purest loyalty can move mountains, uncover miracles, and bring light into the darkest places. And for the town, the memory of that night became a guiding story. Parents told it to their children, teachers shared it in classrooms, and pastors spoke of it in sermons. It became more than history. It became a lesson that sometimes the deepest truths are revealed not by human hands, but by loyal hearts that refuse to stop. This was not just a rescue story. It was not simply about a child pulled from beneath the soil or a town shocked into tears. It was about loyalty that refused to fade, about love that spoke louder than doubt, and about faithfulness that shone even in the darkest corners. Shadow, the German shepherd who would not leave, reminded us all that sometimes the strongest hearts beat inside those who cannot speak with words. His barks were not noise. They were truth, persistence, and devotion. The cemetery that night became more than a place of graves. It became proof that miracles are real, that hope can bloom in the most unlikely of places. It showed that when everyone else turns away, a loyal companion can keep fighting, keep waiting, until the world finally listens. Shadow did what no human dared to do. He trusted his instincts, and he saved a life. To those watching this story, ask yourself, do you believe animals sense what we cannot? Do you believe that sometimes their hearts see farther than our eyes ever could? Many in that town will never doubt again. They know now that animals carry a wisdom we too often ignore, a loyalty too pure for us to measure. And maybe that is the real gift of this story. Not just the survival of a child, not just the faithfulness of a dog, but the reminder that we are surrounded by love that asks nothing in return. The kind of love that waits in the rain, digs through the mud, and refuses to walk away even when the world insists it should. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in kindness. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that loyalty is real, that miracles still happen, and that sometimes the truest heroes walk on four legs. Because the world needs stories like this. Stories that remind us that hope is never lost, that love is never wasted, and that even in forgotten corners, light can be found. And tonight, as you turn off the lights and let the quiet fill your home, remember Shadow's vigil. Remember the way he refused to give up, the way he stayed until life was restored. Hold on to that image and carry it with you. Because if a dog can teach us anything, it is this: never stop believing in the power of love, loyalty, and the miracles hidden in places we least expect.